The night had settled over Naples like a heavy velvet curtain, softening the edges of the city yet deepening its shadows. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting pools of pale gold on the cobblestone streets that twisted and turned like veins through the city's heart. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional clatter of a shutter being drawn in a closed shop formed a subtle, almost hypnotic rhythm. From the quiet corners of these ancient streets, stories whispered in hushed tones, stories of power, loyalty, betrayal, and survival. Among them was the story of Marco Romano, a man whose reputation would stretch across the alleys and waterfronts, whispered with a mixture of awe and fear, Il Falco. Even in a city accustomed to whispers of the underworld, Marco's name carried weight. He was not the loudest, nor the most flamboyant, he did not seek attention or public recognition. Instead, he moved with a measured calm, a quiet intensity that unnerved even the most hardened criminals. Marco Romano was the enforcer of the Vesuviani Clan, one of Naples' most notorious criminal families in 1999, and yet to truly understand him, one needed to look beyond headlines and rumors. The story of Il Falco was not simply about crime or violence, it was about strategy, survival, and the delicate, invisible threads that held the underworld together. As the cool night air drifted through the narrow streets, one could imagine Marco moving through the city with a quiet purpose. He was a man of observation before action, of calculation before impulse. Children playing quietly in the piazzas would glance toward him without fully understanding why, sensing a presence both watchful and unyielding. Shopkeepers, who had learned to tread lightly around the affairs of the Vesuviani, would pause in their closing routines, aware that the night held both opportunity and danger. It was in this world, woven with shadows and quiet power, that Marco had carved his identity, one measured step at a time. Marco's upbringing had been unremarkable on the surface, yet the environment in which he grew up planted the seeds of his eventual path. Naples was a city of contrasts. Vibrant markets and sunlit terraces existed side by side with crumbling tenements and neighborhoods whispered about in fear. Here, a young man could see both the beauty of life and the stark necessity of survival. Marco learned early that power was earned silently, often in ways that were invisible to the casual observer. Every encounter, every glance, every whispered deal in shadowed corners of the city became a lesson in strategy, loyalty, and patience. By the time he had reached adulthood, Marco Romano had already internalized a sense of order and purpose that many of his contemporaries lacked. While others sought attention through violence or reckless displays of bravado, he cultivated an aura of quiet menace, the sort that did not require explanation. In the Vesuviani clan, where hierarchy was as much about fear as it was about respect, this calm, precise presence set him apart. Colleagues began to notice the efficiency with which he carried out tasks, the uncanny ability to anticipate trouble before it arrived. Enemies began to whisper about him in the dark, unsure of where the line between myth and reality truly lay. It was a reputation built not on spectacle but on careful observation and careful choice. Marco moved like a hawk circling above the city, watchful, patient, always aware of the slightest tremor in the environment below. Unlike those who sought to dominate through volume and visibility, Marco's dominance was subtle, creeping in unnoticed until it was undeniable. Those who underestimated him often found themselves in situations that were already carefully orchestrated, decisions already guided by the invisible hand of someone who understood both the human mind and the dangerous rhythm of the streets. Even as the night deepened and the city's usual energy quieted to a near whisper, one could sense the tension that lingered in the air. For Marco, the darkness was not only a veil but also a tool, a time to observe, to plan, and to act with precision. Every alley held the potential for opportunity or threat, every flickering light a reminder that attention and vigilance were inseparable from survival. In this way, the city itself seemed to breathe with him, a living network of silent messages and invisible cues that only someone like Marco could read with clarity. Yet there was more to the story than just strategy and survival. Marco Romano, Il Falco, was a man whose choices reflected a complex blend of loyalty, morality, and necessity. Even those closest to him, who worked alongside him in the Vesuviani clan, could not fully decipher the depths of his reasoning. He was a man of few words, but each one carried weight, each decision resonated long after it was made. This combination of intellect, restraint, and quiet decisiveness ensured that his rise within the clan was swift but meticulously planned. It was as if he had always understood that the true measure of power was not in dominance alone, but in a careful balance between fear and respect, action and patience, visibility and invisibility. The night continued to stretch across Naples, folding the city in layers of shadow and silence. The distant lapping of waves against the harbor and the faint echo of a stray cat's cry through the alleyways lent a rhythm that could lull a listener into contemplation. Yet beneath this calm surface, the pulse of the underworld beat steadily, guided in no small part by Marco Romano's careful influence. He was both part of the city and apart from it, a presence that shaped events without announcing itself, a figure whose story demanded careful listening to be fully understood. As the listener drifts into this narrative, it becomes clear that Marco's story is not merely about crime, notoriety, or infamy. It is a story about the quiet mechanics of power, the subtle art of influence, and the unseen threads that connect people, places, and choices in a world ruled by shadow. Naples at night, with its whispered secrets, narrow streets, and hidden dangers, serves not only as the backdrop but also as a character itself, shaping and reflecting Marco's journey. And as this story unfolds, one begins to understand that the life of Il Falco is a study in contrast, the visible and the hidden, the gentle and the violent, the myth and the man, all intertwined under the soft glow of a city that never truly sleeps. The tale of Marco Romano begins here, in the stillness of Naples at night, where shadows tell stories, and even the quietest footsteps can change the course of fate. It is a story that will wind through alleys, hearts, and hidden rooms, a story meant to be followed slowly, carefully, as the night itself stretches on, carrying the listener gently toward the world of sleep while revealing the life of one of the most enigmatic figures in Naples' underworld, Marco Il Falco Romano. Marco Romano's story did not begin in the shadowed alleys of Naples, though that is where his legend would take shape. It began in the small, tightly knit neighborhood where his family lived, a place where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the faint tang of the sea, and where life moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of ordinary days. The Romano household was modest, its walls lined with photographs and memories of past generations. His father, a man of quiet strength, worked long hours as a dock laborer, his hands rough and calloused from years of lifting and carrying, his voice steady but rarely raised. His mother, patient and observant, managed the household with gentle authority, her eyes always noting the small details others overlooked. Marco grew up in this environment, absorbing lessons not just from words but from the subtleties of human behavior, learning early how attention and discretion could shape outcomes as much as action itself. In this neighborhood, life was a tapestry of contrasts. Children played soccer in the narrow streets, their laughter echoing off stone walls, while just a few steps away, hushed conversations took place behind closed doors, conversations that hinted at debts, favors, and whispered warnings. Marco learned quickly that people were rarely just one thing. Some could smile warmly while harboring grudges that would take years to surface. Others could offer help yet demand loyalty in ways that were subtle, invisible, and binding. From an early age, he observed these dynamics with a keen eye, learning that survival depended on awareness as much as on strength. Marco had siblings who, like him, were shaped by this delicate balance of warmth and vigilance. They were companions in mischief, play, and occasional arguments, yet they were also Marco's first lessons in negotiation, compromise, and influence. Even within his family, he discovered that persuasion and patience often achieved more than aggression or shouting. Small decisions, sharing food, stepping aside in a game, promising to keep a secret, taught him the mechanics of trust and the consequences of betrayal. These lessons, seemingly trivial in childhood, would later define how he approached alliances and conflicts in the world of organized crime. School provided a different kind of education. Teachers recognized Marco as intelligent and observant, though he rarely sought attention or approval. He preferred to watch, to note patterns in behavior, to understand motivations rather than act impulsively. In the crowded, sunlit classrooms, he learned that words could be weapons, and silence often more powerful than speech. Friends came and went, but he retained a core circle of those who respected boundaries and shared subtle understanding. Even in these formative years, he displayed a quiet authority, a presence that drew attention without demanding it. The neighborhood itself was a teacher. Naples, with its winding streets, bustling markets, and sun-washed plazas, offered endless lessons in human nature. Marco wandered these streets with curiosity, observing merchants haggling, neighbors whispering, and the occasional shadow of someone who did not belong. He saw loyalty tested in the smallest ways, a neighbor lending sugar but expecting help in return, a friend defending another only to later retreat under pressure. These small, repeated patterns became the mental framework through which he understood the wider world. It was a school of observation, subtlety, and the constant weighing of consequences. By his mid-teens, Marco had begun to notice the other side of life in Naples, the part that existed in whispered conversations and hidden gatherings, where power, fear, and respect were the currencies of survival. Some boys in the neighborhood joined petty gangs, others learned to navigate debt and favors, while a few, like Marco, moved through both worlds with careful attention. He was not reckless, but neither was he naive. He recognized opportunity when it appeared, and he recognized danger even more clearly. This awareness would later allow him to ascend in the Vesuviani clan with a combination of subtle strategy and quiet, decisive action. Even as his surroundings taught him caution, Marco's home life reinforced values that would temper his methods. His parents, though not wealthy, emphasized loyalty, honor, and the importance of protecting those closest to you. Marco internalized these lessons, not as moral absolutes, but as pragmatic rules for navigating a complex world. He understood that alliances mattered, that trust was fragile, and that the consequences of misjudgment could be severe. These principles became his compass, guiding decisions that required both patience and precision, long before he ever wore the mantle of an enforcer. Marco's adolescence was marked by small tests of character. He faced moments that, in retrospect, were early reflections of his future role, negotiating disputes between peers, mediating tensions in the neighborhood, and observing the outcomes of choices others made recklessly. He noted how intimidation could command respect, but how it was the careful, calculated use of influence that earned lasting loyalty. By watching and learning from both successes and failures around him, he developed an internal map of social dynamics, a mental blueprint that would later guide his every move in the underworld. Even the rhythms of the neighborhood contributed to his understanding of timing and patience. Mornings brought the noise of merchants setting up their stalls, afternoons carried children's laughter, and evenings ushered in quiet caution, with the dimming sun casting long shadows across the streets. Marco internalized these cycles, learning that action, like the city itself, had its proper rhythm. Rush or delay at the wrong moment could lead to misfortune, a lesson he would carry into the meticulously planned operations of the Vesuviani clan. By the time Marco neared adulthood, he was no longer just a boy in the streets of Naples. He was an observer, a strategist, and a quiet force of influence. He had learned the subtleties of negotiation, the weight of loyalty, and the unspoken power of patience. He had seen the fragile line between survival and peril, and he had developed an instinct for walking it carefully, yet decisively. The lessons of family, neighborhood, and city had converged to shape a young man ready to navigate a world in which trust was rare, danger was constant, and every choice carried consequences that could ripple through both friends and enemies alike. The foundation of Marco Romano's life was thus laid, not in grandeur or notoriety, but in quiet observation, careful reasoning, and a deep understanding of the human heart. It was these early experiences, wrapped in the rhythm and subtle lessons of Naples, that would allow him to step into the shadows of the Vesuviani clan with a clarity of purpose, a calm demeanor, and an unmatched awareness of both opportunity and risk. The boy from a modest household had already begun the transformation that would turn him into Il Falco, the enforcer whose presence would quietly command both respect and fear. By the time Marco Romano reached his teenage years, the streets of Naples had become both his playground and his classroom. The city was alive with lessons for those who paid attention, and Marco did. He wandered the winding alleys, the scent of fresh bread and simmering tomato sauces mingling with the faint, metallic tang of the harbor air. Every street corner, every shuttered shop, every whisper behind a closed door carried stories, some mundane, some darkly compelling. It was in these quiet observations that he first began to understand the delicate balance between power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, survival and ambition. Even as a young teenager, Marco had a sense of awareness that set him apart from his peers. He noticed how older boys commanded attention with force and intimidation, how petty gangs established territories marked by spray-painted symbols or subtle signs known only to insiders. Yet he did not seek to compete through loudness or brute strength. Instead, he learned to move with a careful balance, observing before acting, listening before speaking, and calculating the potential consequences of every choice. In these early years, the seeds of his later reputation as Il Falco were being sown: patience, strategy, and the quiet ability to command respect without overt displays of dominance. Petty thefts and minor scrapes began to mark his adolescence. A stolen bicycle here, a pilfered bag of oranges there, actions that might have seemed insignificant to outsiders, were lessons in understanding human reactions, in testing boundaries, and in learning how to slip through unnoticed. Marco approached each act with a calculated mindset, not for the thrill of rebellion alone but to study the mechanisms of fear, authority, and consequence. He learned quickly that the smallest gestures, how one looked someone in the eye, the timing of a movement, the choice of words, could determine whether a confrontation escalated or dissolved quietly. The streets of his neighborhood were rarely empty, even at dusk. Children played soccer, elders conversed from doorways, and merchants called out their wares, while nearby, whispers of small-time hustlers and gang disputes carried from shadowed corners. Marco was aware of all these layers, able to separate the ordinary from the dangerous, the trivial from the consequential. He began to form alliances with a select few peers who were similarly observant, individuals who understood that the unspoken rules of the streets mattered more than overt bravado. Together, they navigated both the everyday challenges of adolescence and the small, informal hierarchies that existed in their microcosm of Naples. Conflict was inevitable. Disputes arose over territory, respect, or the spoils of petty crimes, and Marco learned how to navigate these moments with a blend of tact and measured force. He did not strike first in most situations, rather, he waited, evaluated, and then acted with precision. Even in moments of confrontation, there was a quiet rhythm to his movements, a sense that he understood not only the immediate problem but the longer chain of consequences that might follow. By watching how others reacted, friends, adversaries, and authority figures alike, Marco honed an instinct for both risk and opportunity, learning to read the subtle cues that would later allow him to anticipate threats and exploit weaknesses in ways that seemed almost prescient. It was during this period that Marco first became aware of the larger criminal networks that operated in Naples. Small-time gangs were only the surface of something far more organized, a world of silent agreements, invisible codes, and strategic alliances. He observed older enforcers from a distance, noting their methods and the respect they commanded without shouting. Marco began to understand that real power was not flashy or reckless, it was precise, quiet, and calculated. These realizations, though subtle, would guide him as he began to take steps beyond petty neighborhood disputes into the orbit of the Vesuviani Clan. School continued to play a role in his development. Teachers saw his intelligence, his ability to grasp complex ideas, and his tendency to analyze situations before participating. Though Marco rarely sought attention, his quiet confidence made him noticeable. He learned to balance the demands of formal education with the informal education of the streets, merging lessons of discipline, patience, and observation with lessons of strategy, subtle intimidation, and negotiation. This duality, of structured learning and street wisdom, was beginning to define the young man he was becoming. Friendships were both a source of strength and a training ground. Marco cultivated a small circle of peers he trusted, carefully testing their loyalty and observing their reactions in challenging situations. Games of skill, minor confrontations, and shared secrets became exercises in understanding human behavior. Marco's patience allowed him to see patterns, predict responses, and navigate social dynamics with a precision beyond his years. Even in moments of mischief, there was a deliberate intent, a quiet methodology that distinguished him from others who acted impulsively or out of mere bravado. Family continued to anchor him, providing both moral lessons and subtle guidance. Though the world of the streets offered immediate, tangible rewards, the stability of home reinforced long-term thinking, an understanding of loyalty, and the value of calculated restraint. Marco observed his parents' interactions, the way disputes were resolved quietly, and the way respect and authority were maintained without unnecessary conflict. These lessons, absorbed without conscious effort, would later inform his methods as an enforcer, shaping his approach to negotiation, loyalty, and enforcement. By the end of his teenage years, Marco had developed a foundation of skills, instincts, and awareness that set him apart. He had learned to observe, to predict, and to act with calculated intent. He understood the rhythm of the streets, the psychology of his peers, and the subtle cues that indicated danger or opportunity. His small forays into theft, disputes, and alliances were not random acts of rebellion, they were exercises in understanding the mechanics of influence, fear, and respect. In the quiet moments of reflection, walking through the narrow alleys of his neighborhood as the city settled into night, Marco Romano was already practicing the skills that would make him a figure of both fear and admiration in the years to come. It was in these formative years, in the delicate balance of observation, patience, and experimentation, that Marco's future began to crystallize. He was no longer just a boy testing boundaries, he was a strategist in training, a young man learning the silent language of power. Each decision, each calculated risk, each measured act of courage or restraint contributed to the transformation that would ultimately define him. Marco Romano's adolescence was not marked by impulsive rebellion alone, but by a deliberate, patient cultivation of skills that would serve him well as he stepped into the darker, more dangerous world of organized crime. By the time the city fell fully into night, and the distant sounds of Naples quieted to a gentle hum, Marco Romano had already begun walking a path that few would understand, and even fewer would predict. The lessons of the streets, the family, and the city itself had merged, forming a young man capable of observing, calculating, and executing with a precision that would one day earn him the name Il Falco, a figure both respected and feared in the shadows of Naples. Marco's first encounter with the Vesuviani clan did not occur in a moment of spectacle or fanfare. There were no grand announcements, no boisterous displays of power, only the quiet gravity of a meeting that would alter the trajectory of his life. He had heard their name whispered in the streets, carried in hushed tones by older boys and neighborhood elders alike. The Vesuviani were not just a gang, they were a network, an organization whose influence extended into neighborhoods, businesses, and the hidden arteries of Naples' underworld. Marco, careful and observant, understood that being noticed by them was both an opportunity and a test, a chance to prove himself, but also a risk that missteps could be fatal. The introduction came through a subtle chain of connections, the kind that Marco had learned to navigate with patience and discretion. A friend of a friend, someone with just enough credibility to make the connection, arranged a meeting in a quiet, dimly lit café near the edge of the harbor. The café itself was unremarkable to an outsider, chipped tiles, faded wooden tables, and the smell of strong coffee mixing with the salty sea air. Yet for Marco, this setting was a microcosm of the city itself, layers of ordinary life masking currents of influence, power, and unspoken rules. As he entered, the room seemed to shift subtly, though no one spoke of it. The regular patrons, absorbed in their own routines, did not notice him. But the few who had come for business that evening, men whose quiet demeanor and deliberate movements marked them as part of something larger, watched with an intensity that was almost imperceptible. Marco, sensing the weight of attention, adjusted his posture and expression with deliberate care. He had long since learned that presence could communicate more than words, and that patience and composure could convey confidence more powerfully than any display of aggression. The first introductions were measured and calm. Handshakes were firm but not overpowering, words were few, and silence filled the spaces in between. Marco noticed small details, the way one man's eyes scanned the room continuously, the subtle tapping of a finger against the edge of a glass, the faint creak of the chair as another leaned forward slightly to emphasize a point. Each gesture, each glance, carried meaning, and Marco absorbed it all with the precision of a hawk. He understood that in this world, knowledge was power, and observation was a weapon as sharp as any blade. It was not long before Marco was given his first task. It was a minor assignment in the grand scope of the Vesuviani clan, yet for him, it represented both a test and an opportunity. He was to deliver a message to a local business owner, a message that required tact, discretion, and an understanding of fear without resorting to unnecessary violence. The assignment seemed simple to the casual observer, but Marco approached it as a puzzle. He considered the personality of the recipient, the timing, the possible reactions of neighbors and passers-by. Every step was calculated, every choice deliberate, every interaction a lesson in the subtle art of influence. The successful completion of this task did not make Marco a celebrity within the clan, but it earned him recognition and cautious trust. He realized that the true measure of value in this world was not spectacle or showmanship, but the ability to execute assignments with precision, reliability, and discretion. As he carried out the task, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of alignment between his skills, his instincts, and the expectations of the men who watched him from the shadows. This alignment would become a defining trait throughout his career as Il Falco, guiding him in both the overt and hidden aspects of his work. Beyond the assignments, Marco observed the internal dynamics of the Vesuviani clan with keen interest. He noticed how respect was earned, how loyalty was measured, and how authority was maintained not through fear alone but through careful calculation, timing, and subtle displays of influence. Meetings were conducted with quiet precision, decisions weighed carefully, and disagreements resolved with the softest hint of intimidation or persuasion. Marco understood that the clan's strength was in its discipline, its structure, and its ability to project control while remaining largely invisible to the uninitiated. As the weeks turned into months, Marco became increasingly involved in the clan's activities, his reputation growing quietly but steadily. He handled tasks that required negotiation, subtle intimidation, and observation, each one reinforcing his growing understanding of the balance between loyalty, fear, and efficiency. He began to cultivate relationships within the clan, forming alliances with individuals whose intelligence and discretion matched his own. These relationships were delicate, requiring patience, trust, and a continuous evaluation of motives. Marco learned to navigate these complexities with the same quiet vigilance that had served him so well in the streets of his youth. Through these experiences, Marco also began to see the broader impact of the clan's operations on Naples itself. Their influence was woven into the fabric of the neighborhoods, into businesses, and even into the informal networks of everyday life. Marco observed the subtle ways in which power shaped behavior, a shopkeeper's cautious compliance, a neighbor's silent acknowledgement, the unspoken rules that everyone followed without question. He saw that true power was often invisible, a quiet force that directed the flow of life without overt confrontation. This realization reinforced his understanding that discretion, strategy, and timing were as critical as strength or courage in the world he was entering. Marco's early days with the Vesuviani clan also tested his character in ways he had not previously experienced. He faced decisions that required moral judgment, strategic thinking, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Each choice carried consequences, and he learned quickly that mistakes, even minor ones, could ripple through relationships, operations, and trust. Yet rather than being intimidated, Marco approached these challenges as opportunities for growth, refining his instincts, sharpening his judgment, and reinforcing the quiet authority that would become his hallmark. By the time he had fully established himself within the clan, Marco Romano had already begun to embody the traits that would earn him the name Il Falco. He moved with deliberate purpose, observing before acting, calculating before speaking, and maintaining a calm, measured presence that demanded respect without shouting. The lessons of his childhood, the subtle education of the streets, and the careful mentorship of his early encounters with the Vesuviani had converged to create a young man capable of navigating one of Naples' most dangerous and complex organizations with skill, patience, and quiet precision. It was in these early days that Marco understood the truth of his new world. Influence was a matter of observation, timing, and control, respect was earned quietly, loyalty was fragile and required continuous cultivation, and power was most effective when wielded subtly, invisibly, and decisively. The Vesuviani clan was both a teacher and a testing ground, shaping him into an enforcer who could command fear and admiration in equal measure. Marco Romano's journey within the clan had begun not with violence or notoriety, but with observation, patience, and the careful cultivation of skill, the quiet, invisible beginnings of a legend that would one day be known as Il Falco. As Marco Romano began to navigate his role within the Vesuviani clan, he discovered that reputation was more potent than any weapon and more enduring than fear alone. It was not enough to simply complete tasks or follow orders, one had to demonstrate a combination of precision, patience, and quiet authority that could ripple through the organization without ever needing to shout. Marco understood this instinctively. Even as he carried out his early assignments, he moved with a calm confidence that set him apart. He did not seek attention, yet attention found him, drawn to the efficiency of his actions and the quiet decisiveness that accompanied every decision. His rise was not instantaneous. It was gradual, deliberate, marked by careful observation and the steady accumulation of trust. Marco approached each task as a study, analyzing the behavior of those involved, predicting outcomes, and ensuring that his presence was felt without ever being ostentatious. Whether collecting debts, delivering messages, or overseeing small operations, he executed each responsibility with a meticulous attention to detail. This methodical approach earned him respect, not only from his peers but also from those who held higher positions within the clan. They recognized in him a rare combination of intelligence and composure, a mind capable of navigating the delicate balances of loyalty, fear, and influence that governed their world. Marco's reputation began to spread quietly, carried by whispers in the dimly lit alleys and hushed conversations in cafes and markets. Those who had seen him in action spoke of his uncanny ability to command a room with just a glance or a measured gesture. Stories circulated of his patience in negotiation, his calm demeanor under pressure, and his calculated efficiency. Yet Marco himself remained largely in the background, observing the effects of his actions, learning from the reactions of others, and refining the strategies that would later define his approach as an enforcer. He understood that true power was rarely announced, it was shown through results, through the way others adjusted their behavior in response to your presence, often without realizing why. One of the key elements of his rise was his understanding of human psychology. Marco could read a person's intentions from subtle cues, the tightening of a jaw, the shifting of weight, the hesitation in a voice. These observations allowed him to anticipate conflict, de-escalate potential threats, and assert influence without unnecessary confrontation. In many ways, his rise was as much about mental acuity as it was about physical capability. He became a strategist, a silent observer whose influence shaped decisions, redirected tensions, and ensured outcomes favorable to the clan. It was a quiet, subtle authority, one that demanded respect precisely because it was rarely flaunted. The streets of Naples continued to serve as both his classroom and his proving ground. Marco moved through familiar neighborhoods with a heightened awareness, noting alliances, monitoring rival factions, and quietly assessing opportunities. Every encounter, whether with a friend, a rival, or a casual observer, was an opportunity to test strategy and refine his approach. He began to understand the rhythms of his city, the way tension ebbed and flowed, how influence could shift quietly, and how seemingly small actions could have cascading effects. Through these lessons, he developed a nuanced understanding of the balance between visibility and discretion, the interplay between action and perception. Marco's rise was also shaped by his loyalty and reliability. In a world where trust was fragile and betrayal common, his ability to maintain discretion, deliver results, and uphold the clan's code earned him not only respect but also a growing degree of autonomy. Leaders began to assign him responsibilities that required judgment, discretion, and strategic thinking. His success in these tasks reinforced his reputation, creating a positive feedback loop. The more he demonstrated competence, the greater the trust he received, and the more complex and high-stakes his assignments became. This period of growth was not without challenges. Rival factions, internal competition, and occasional betrayals tested his judgment and patience. Marco navigated these trials with a quiet focus, rarely reacting impulsively, always observing, and choosing the right moment to act. He learned that power was not maintained through constant displays of force, but through calculated decisions, strategic patience, and the ability to influence outcomes without drawing unnecessary attention. Each challenge honed his skills, each confrontation reinforced his understanding of loyalty, and each success strengthened his growing aura of respect and quiet authority. As Marco continued to solidify his position, he also began to cultivate subtle networks of influence beyond his immediate responsibilities. He recognized that information, relationships, and strategic alliances were as important as direct action. By quietly observing others, nurturing relationships, and understanding the motivations of those around him, he positioned himself as an enforcer who could not only execute tasks but also anticipate and shape the needs of the clan. His reputation became multidimensional. He was respected as a capable operative, feared as a strategist, and trusted as someone who could navigate the complexities of loyalty and influence. Even as his influence expanded, Marco maintained a measured presence, careful not to attract attention that could destabilize his position. He understood that visibility was both a tool and a risk, and that the most effective leaders often operated from the shadows, guiding outcomes without overt displays of power. His quiet authority allowed him to act decisively when necessary while remaining largely unobserved by those who might wish to undermine him. In this way, his rise was not a crescendo of loud victories but a series of measured steps, each one reinforcing his growing reputation and securing his place within the clan's hierarchy. By the time he had fully established himself as a trusted enforcer of the Vesuviani clan, Marco Romano had become a figure whose presence was felt more than it was seen. Stories of his calm efficiency, strategic insight, and unwavering composure circulated quietly through Naples, reinforcing his reputation while maintaining an air of mystery. He was no longer merely a young man navigating the streets of his neighborhood, he had become a strategist, a quiet force within one of the city's most powerful organizations. His rise was defined not by spectacle or notoriety, but by subtle influence, careful calculation, and an unwavering commitment to precision. In the quiet moments, as Marco moved through the city at night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He understood that each step, each decision, each observation had contributed to his growth. The lessons of his youth, the careful cultivation of patience and discretion, and the strategic acumen he had developed within the clan had all converged to create the enforcer now known as Il Falco. His rise was not a story of reckless ambition but of deliberate, measured progress, a testament to the quiet, relentless power of observation, strategy, and control. Through his calm, deliberate actions, Marco Romano had transformed from a careful observer of the streets into a central figure within one of Naples' most feared and respected criminal organizations. He had earned a reputation that combined fear, respect, and quiet admiration, a presence that shaped events without drawing unnecessary attention. The rise of Il Falco was a story of patience, strategy, and subtle influence, a journey that demonstrated how true power could be both seen and unseen, felt without being loudly proclaimed, and respected without being ostentatious. Nightfall in Naples transformed the city into a world of soft shadows, muted sounds, and subtle, shifting energy. The warm glow of the setting sun faded behind distant hills, leaving streets bathed in silvery moonlight and the occasional flicker of street lamps. The city's heartbeat slowed, though it never truly stopped. There was a rhythm to the night, a cadence that only those who moved through it with awareness could perceive. For Marco Romano, these hours were both a sanctuary and a stage, a time when the subtle patterns of power, loyalty, and danger became visible to a trained eye. The narrow alleys, winding between buildings whose facades bore the weathered marks of centuries, held stories in every stone. Marco walked these streets deliberately, his movements quiet, his gaze attentive to every shadow, every sound, every subtle change in the environment. The creak of a shutter, the distant laughter of late-night revelers, the faint echo of a car door closing, each was a note in the symphony of the night, a signal that could indicate opportunity, risk, or the mere passage of time. For Marco, reading these signals was second nature, a skill honed through years of observation, patience, and careful experimentation in the streets of his youth. Naples at night was a city of contrasts. On one side were the familiar rhythms of domestic life, the soft hum of conversation behind apartment windows, the gentle flicker of television screens in rooms where families gathered, the muted footsteps of neighbors returning from work or errands. On the other side, hidden in the shadows, were currents of tension and influence, a delicate web of rivalries, debts, and loyalties that governed the unseen world of the underworld. Marco moved between these layers with a careful awareness, understanding that the balance of the city depended as much on what remained invisible as on what was openly displayed. The harbor, illuminated by the occasional glow of dock lights, reflected the moon in shifting patterns, the water moving with a quiet, relentless energy. Marco often found himself drawn to these edges of the city, where the rhythm of commerce, smuggling, and clandestine movement created a living map of influence. Watching from the shadows, he noted the comings and goings of small boats, the subtle interactions of workers, and the presence of individuals who moved with deliberate caution. Each observation reinforced his understanding that the underworld was a network of interdependent actions, a world in which timing, discretion, and subtle persuasion mattered more than brute force. Within the city, Marco had begun to map not only the physical terrain but also the human landscape. He understood the alliances and rivalries that shaped neighborhoods, the individuals whose influence extended quietly yet powerfully, and the small but significant gestures that revealed intent or deception. Even ordinary citizens, unaware of his observations, became part of a pattern he could read, the way a shopkeeper's eyes lingered on certain faces, the quick adjustments of posture when a known enforcer passed by, the whispered warnings shared in shadowed corners. Marco learned that power was often expressed in absence, in the subtle recalibration of behavior by those around him. The streets themselves seemed to breathe at night, expanding and contracting with the presence of people, the weight of history, and the constant, underlying tension that defined Naples' underworld. Marco moved in harmony with this rhythm, his awareness attuned to the faintest signals. A footstep that lingered too long, a glance exchanged between strangers, the smell of smoke from a distant kitchen, all could indicate a shift in circumstances that required attention. He had developed an instinct for interpreting these signals, a quiet intuition that guided both his movements and his decisions. Marco's understanding of the streets extended to the subtle economy of fear and respect. He observed how influence could be projected without confrontation, how a single glance or carefully chosen word could shape outcomes, and how the perception of presence often mattered more than physical action. In the alleys and plazas of Naples, he saw that power was fluid, shifting with small gestures, whispered words, and the continuous negotiation of trust. To him, these interactions were both lessons and opportunities, moments to refine his judgment, test alliances, and anticipate potential threats. Even as he navigated this world, Marco remained attentive to the rhythms of ordinary life. He noticed the children playing quietly in the piazzas, the lovers walking along the waterfront, the elderly sitting on benches, exchanging stories and memories. These scenes, seemingly removed from the underworld's influence, offered insight into the broader patterns of human behavior, the ways in which people adapted to their environment, and the subtle forces that shaped decisions both large and small. For Marco, these observations reinforced a central truth: influence and power were inseparable from context, and even the most clandestine operations unfolded within a living, breathing city whose rhythms could not be ignored. The night also offered opportunities for quiet reflection. As he moved through familiar streets, Marco considered the events of the day, the interactions he had observed, and the subtle signals that might indicate shifts in alliances or threats. He understood that knowledge accumulated gradually, that patterns became visible only through patient observation, and that the ability to anticipate change was a critical skill in a world where instability could strike without warning. These reflections were part of his training, an ongoing exercise in awareness, strategy, and the art of quiet influence. Through these nocturnal wanderings, Marco developed a nuanced understanding of his role within the Vesuviani clan. He was not simply an enforcer tasked with executing orders, He was a strategist, a silent observer whose awareness shaped decisions before action was ever taken. He recognized that true authority was earned through perception, consistency, and subtle manipulation of circumstances. His growing reputation as Il Falco was built not only on the tasks he completed but also on the careful, almost imperceptible ways in which he projected presence, assessed risk, and guided outcomes from the shadows. By the time the first hints of dawn began to brush the horizon, the city had shifted once again. The streets quieted further, shops opened slowly, and the nocturnal rhythm yielded to the patterns of daily life. Marco, having absorbed the lessons of the night, retreated into the quieter corners of the city, carrying with him the knowledge of human behavior, the subtle currents of influence, and the growing awareness that the true measure of power was not in force alone, but in observation, patience, and the ability to act decisively when the moment was right. Naples at night had become more than a setting, it was a teacher, a partner, and a reflection of the world Marco would continue to navigate. In the quiet interplay of shadows, light, and movement, he honed the skills that would define him, learning to read the city as a living, breathing map of opportunity, risk, and human nature. It was in these hours that Il Falco emerged, not through action alone, but through understanding, awareness, and the subtle mastery of the rhythms of life and power. By the end of each night, Marco Romano carried the lessons of the streets with him, the patterns of movement, the behavior of individuals, the ebb and flow of influence, and the delicate balance between visibility and discretion. These lessons would shape every decision, every alliance, and every strategic move he would make, reinforcing his quiet authority and ensuring that his presence would be felt long before his actions were seen. The city had taught him that night was never empty, that power moved in whispers and glances, and that survival depended on knowing when to act and when to remain unseen. Marco Romano's first assignments as an enforcer were not marked by spectacle or fanfare, they were subtle, quiet tests that required discretion, judgment, and a measured hand. The Vesuviani clan did not simply assign tasks to see who could wield a weapon or intimidate a rival, they observed, assessed, and tested those who would carry influence for them. Marco's early responsibilities involved enforcing agreements, reminding those who had overstepped boundaries, and ensuring that the clan's presence was felt without creating unnecessary attention. Each task was an opportunity to learn, to refine his instincts, and to understand the delicate balance between power and subtlety. His initial operations often took place in the quieter corners of the city. A cafe in a narrow alley, a small warehouse near the harbor, or the dimly lit backroom of a family-owned business became theaters for these first tests. Marco approached each situation with the patience and awareness he had cultivated from years of observation in his neighborhood. He noticed the smallest cues, the way a hand trembled when a threat was implied, the slight hesitation in a voice, the unspoken tension in a posture. These details, invisible to most, informed every decision he made and allowed him to exert influence without unnecessary force. One of his first tasks involved a dispute between two merchants who had violated a quiet understanding with the clan. The issue could have escalated quickly, but Marco's approach was deliberate and measured. He listened carefully to both sides, observing not just their words but the subtleties of their behavior. A shift in tone, a glance exchanged, the cadence of speech, all were signals he interpreted to understand motivation and predict potential outcomes. With calm authority, he intervened, enforcing the clan's wishes in a way that reminded both men of the consequences of defiance while leaving room for compliance without humiliation. The matter was resolved efficiently, without violence, and Marco's reputation as a calculated and effective enforcer began to grow. The next assignments tested a different aspect of his skill, the management of fear and respect. Marco learned that presence alone could command attention, and that the perception of potential consequences often achieved more than immediate action. In one instance, he was tasked with visiting a neighborhood where debts had gone unpaid. Rather than resorting to threats or aggression, Marco used careful observation, timing, and subtle gestures to convey the seriousness of the situation. The debts were settled quietly, and the individuals involved left the encounter with a clear understanding of both respect and boundaries. It was a lesson in the invisible power of strategy over overt force. As Marco's responsibilities grew, he he began to handle more complex assignments. Some involved coordination with other members of the clan, requiring communication, timing, and anticipation of the reactions of multiple parties. Others required the careful navigation of rival factions, ensuring that the Vesuviani's influence remained unchallenged without provoking unnecessary conflict. Marco approached each scenario as a puzzle, analyzing the environment, assessing risks, and predicting outcomes. His calm demeanor and meticulous planning allowed him to execute these tasks efficiently, earning further trust and recognition within the clan. The work of an enforcer also demanded adaptability. No two situations were the same, and Marco quickly learned to adjust his approach based on context, individuals involved, and the subtle signals of the environment. Sometimes, a quiet word in a shadowed doorway achieved what a show of force could not. Other times, the mere act of observing and recording behavior allowed him to anticipate and prevent problems before they escalated. These experiences reinforced his understanding that true authority lay not in immediate action but in a consistent, strategic application of influence over time. Violence was a tool, but one to be wielded judiciously. Marco recognized early that unnecessary aggression could destabilize relationships, provoke retaliation, or attract attention from law enforcement. The careful use of calculated intimidation, combined with observation and timing, often achieved the desired results more effectively than brute force. In moments when physical enforcement became unavoidable, Marco acted with precision, ensuring that the outcome reinforced his authority while minimizing risk. Each experience taught him not only the mechanics of enforcement but also the subtle art of maintaining respect, loyalty, and fear in equal measure. Marco's assignments also revealed the importance of patience. Often, the most effective outcomes were achieved not through immediate action but by waiting for the right moment. Observing, listening, and understanding the flow of events allowed him to act with maximum impact and minimal exposure. These early experiences strengthened his ability to anticipate consequences, recognize patterns, and execute decisions with a quiet authority that became a hallmark of his reputation as Il Falco. Through these first assignments, Marco began to understand the broader implications of his role. He was not merely enforcing rules, he was shaping the environment, guiding behavior, and subtly influencing the perception of power. Every interaction, every measured response, and every strategic decision contributed to a network of influence that extended beyond the immediate situation. His work reinforced the clan's dominance, ensured compliance, and cultivated a sense of inevitability in those who encountered him. It was an education in the psychology of control, the importance of perception, and the delicate balance between fear and respect. By the end of this period, Marco had transformed from a keen observer into a skilled enforcer, capable of executing assignments with precision, subtlety, and strategic foresight. His early successes were quiet but significant, building a foundation of trust, influence, and authority that would shape the next phase of his career. He had learned that effectiveness in the underworld was measured not by notoriety or spectacle, but by the consistent, disciplined application of skill, patience, and awareness. In the quiet of the streets, as Marco moved between assignments, he reflected on the lessons of his early work. He understood that enforcement was not simply about action but about perception, anticipation, and the careful orchestration of outcomes. He recognized that influence, once established, could ripple outward, shaping decisions, behavior, and even alliances in ways that were invisible to the casual observer. This understanding became the cornerstone of his approach, ensuring that each step he took as an enforcer reinforced his growing reputation and solidified his place within the Vesuviani clan. Through these formative experiences, Marco Romano had begun to fully embody the qualities that would earn him the moniker Il Falco. He moved with quiet purpose, observed with meticulous care, and acted with deliberate authority. Each assignment reinforced his understanding of human behavior, the subtle dynamics of influence, and the art of enforcement as a blend of strategy, psychology, and timing. By the time the first faint light of dawn brushed the horizon, Marco's position within the clan had shifted subtly but decisively. He was no longer merely a participant, he was an emerging force, quietly shaping events and commanding respect in a world where subtlety often proved more powerful than overt aggression. Marco first noticed Sofia on an evening when the city of Naples seemed wrapped in a soft blue haze, the kind that lowered every sound and stretched every shadow. He had been stationed near the old conservatory, lingering in the quiet corner of a narrow stone alley while waiting for a discreet meeting between two Vesuviani messengers. His task was simple: observe, remain unseen, and ensure no one followed or listened. Yet his usually sharp attention drifted when a single violin note floated through the air, clear enough to cut through the dimness like a sliver of light. It wasn't loud, nor was it dramatic. It was simply beautiful, so unexpectedly pure that it unsettled him more than the threat of ambush ever could. Inside the dim-lit rehearsal room, Sofia sat alone with her violin resting against her shoulder. Her eyes were closed, her brow relaxed, and the bow glided across the strings as if guided by her heartbeat. The music felt like a whisper from a world Marco had long forgotten. He found himself leaning slightly forward, the way he used to as a boy when watching falcons trace circles in the sky. She played with a quiet intensity that suggested she was pouring secrets into every note, secrets that drifted into the corridor and brushed against Marco's guarded mind like a gentle hand. He would have stepped back to resume his duty, but the music wrapped around him with the gentleness of falling snow. For a man accustomed to reading danger in every gesture and preparing for cold decisions, this softness was unsettling. He reminded himself that distractions were costly, yet he lingered anyway. When she finished, the last note faded like a dying ember. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, they met Marco's through the window's reflection. He straightened quickly, reminding himself of his place in the shadows. Later that night, when the Vesuviani messengers arrived and exchanged their documents, Marco performed his duty flawlessly. But even as he scanned the alleyways, part of his awareness drifted back to that melody. It followed him like a gentle echo, stirring memories of quieter years, afternoons by the sea, his mother's humming, the soft rustle of pages when his grandfather read stories aloud. He realized how rarely he allowed himself to feel anything beyond the rigid boundaries of survival. The next evening, he passed the conservatory again, this time without an assignment. He told himself it was coincidence, but he knew better. Light spilled from the same window, warm and golden, like the glow of a safe harbor. Inside, Sofia stood beside a music stand, adjusting her sheet music. She wasn't playing yet, she simply breathed, preparing, as if the stillness itself was part of the composition. When she finally lifted her bow, the first note rose and filled the room with a sound that felt like a gentle hand placed on Marco's chest. She noticed him again, her gaze flicked to the window, and this time she smiled. Not a broad smile, but something soft and knowing. Marco looked away, heat rising in his face. The last time he had blushed, he had been a teenager barely trusted to run errands. Now he was Il Falco, feared and respected, yet her smile left him strangely unguarded. A few days later, fate placed them on the same street as she left the conservatory. The evening was calm, the sky deep violet. Sofia carried her violin case gently, as if it held a living thing. Marco stepped aside, but she paused before passing. "You're the man from the window," she said, her voice warm. Marco felt something tighten in him. "I didn't mean to intrude," he replied softly. "Your music, it caught my attention." "Music does that," she said. "It finds people who aren't looking for it." They walked slowly toward the small piazza nearby, speaking in cautious but comfortable tones. Sofia told him she had been playing since childhood, that music was her refuge from the noise of the world. Marco listened more attentively than he had listened to anyone in years. When she asked what he did, he hesitated. He offered a vague answer about security work, distant from the reality of his life. She didn't press him. Instead, she spoke about Naples, the beauty beneath its chaos, the ancient stories tucked into every street. Marco found himself responding with thoughts shaped by long nights watching the city from the shadows. She listened with a patience he had only seen in falcons waiting for the right moment to move. They parted at the fountain's edge, a breeze moving through the square. As she walked away, Marco realized something both unsettling and comforting. In her presence, he felt human again. He felt seen, not as an enforcer or a silent shadow, but as a man who still longed for gentleness. That night, lying awake, Marco replayed their encounter. He sensed that Sophia might become a fragile bridge between the life he lived and the life he wished he could have. And though he knew the dangers of letting someone close, especially someone innocent, he also knew that some connections refused to be ignored. Her music had already settled in the quiet chambers of his mind like a soft, enduring light. In the days that followed, Marco found subtle excuses to pass near the conservatory, though he tried to convince himself it was merely part of observing the neighborhood. Each time he heard a violin scale drifting through an open window, something inside him softened. He noticed details he had long overlooked, the way sunlight fell across cobblestones, the stillness of early mornings, the calm rhythm of the sea brushing against the harbor walls. These simple moments grounded him in a reality he had nearly forgotten. He began to understand how deeply the constant weight of clan obligations had shaped him, how rarely he allowed his mind to rest. And in those quiet intervals, Sophia's music wove itself through his thoughts like a gentle thread. He felt unexpectedly drawn to peace there. Marco received the assignment on an evening when the air felt strangely heavy, as though Naples itself sensed what was coming. Don Vittorio had summoned him to a quiet room above a shuttered tailor shop, a place the clan used only when secrecy mattered more than comfort. The Don sat in the dim light with a stack of reports beside him, his fingers tapping softly against the wood as he described the situation. A traitor, he said, someone within their own circles, had begun leaking route schedules and internal movements. Nothing catastrophic yet, but each leak was precise, deliberate, and dangerous. Vittorio's tone suggested urgency, but his eyes held something deeper, an unspoken calculation. Marco knew that look well, yet he pretended not to notice. The assignment was simple on the surface: investigate the suspected man, gather proof, and ensure he did not escape if the accusations proved true. But the moment Marco heard the name, a faint tension tightened in his chest. The suspect, Luca Bernardi, was someone Marco had worked beside several times, quiet, competent, unremarkable in all the ways a clan soldier needed to be. He was not ambitious, nor was he reckless. Marco had never once sensed instability in him. That alone made the accusation unsettling. Still, he accepted the order with a nod, though he felt the first quiet stirrings of doubt. That night, Marco walked through the narrow Spanish quarter streets where Luca lived. Shuttered windows hid families preparing for bed, and stray cats moved silently along the cobblestones. Marco's instincts guided him, each step measured and careful. He wasn't there to intimidate Luca, nor to confront him without understanding the full picture. Instead, he observed from the shadows, watching how Luca returned home, how he glanced over his shoulder with an anxiety that suggested guilt, or fear. Marco could not yet tell which. The following day, Marco visited the docks where Luca oversaw a small unloading crew. He watched from a distance, hidden among stacked crates. Luca performed his duties with rigid focus, barely speaking to anyone. But something was off. His movements held an edge of tension, as though he expected something to go wrong at any moment. Marco noticed how Luca repeatedly checked the alleyways behind him, how he flinched when a crate dropped loudly nearby. These were not the signs of a traitor reveling in deceit, they were the signs of a man being hunted. Marco approached him only after the shift ended, walking casually along the path as though they had merely crossed by chance. Luca stiffened when he saw him, but Marco spoke gently, asking about work, about his family, easing into the conversation without pressure. After a few minutes, Marco mentioned the rumors, not accusing, not threatening, simply stating what others whispered. Luca's reaction was not one of practiced innocence or cold denial. Instead, his face drained of color, and he looked around in panic as though walls might be listening. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Rather than press him, Marco invited him for a walk along the quieter streets near the marina. The night was calm, the water reflecting faint silver under the moonlight. There, with no one close enough to listen, Luca confessed that he had noticed someone watching him, following him at odd hours. At first he thought it was Vesuviani men checking his loyalty, but then he realized something darker. Strangers were asking about his habits, his routines, even his family. That was when fear had settled into him like a sickness. He admitted he had not reported it because he worried the clan would see his fear as weakness. Now he worried they suspected him because he had remained silent. Marco listened without interruption. Something in Luca's voice felt undeniably sincere. There were too many details, too much confusion, too much raw fear for this to be a performance. Marco saw no signs of deceit. If anything, Luca looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice he didn't understand. And yet, the reports Vittorio had shown Marco earlier contained real leaks that had to come from somewhere near Luca's position. The contradiction troubled Marco deeply. He felt like someone was arranging pieces around him, creating the illusion of guilt. Before they could speak further, a distant pair of footsteps echoed along the marina. Marco turned sharply, scanning the shadows between fishing boats. Luca froze. A silhouette slipped behind a cargo container, quick and deliberate. Marco stepped forward, but by the time he reached the spot, the intruder was gone. Only footprints remained, fresh, pointed toward the alley leading away from the harbor. Luca's fear now felt justified. Marco returned to Luca, who looked shaken to his core. He assured him he would look into the matter personally. Luca seemed both relieved and terrified by the promise. When Marco escorted him home, he noticed a faint scrape on Luca's doorframe, the kind left by a tool used to test locks. Someone had indeed been trying to enter. This was no coincidence. As Marco walked back toward the heart of the city, he considered every angle. If Luca truly was innocent, someone was setting him up with methodical precision. But why? And more importantly, who stood to gain from accusing him? The deeper Marco looked, the more he wondered if the traitor Don Vittorio sought was not Luca at all, but someone higher, someone who needed a scapegoat. When Marco finally reported his findings, Vittorio listened silently. His expression gave nothing away. He simply nodded and told Marco to continue his investigation. Yet Marco felt an uneasy shift in the room, a subtle coldness beneath the Don's calm facade. For the first time, Marco sensed that this assignment was not about uncovering truth but about confirming someone else's narrative. And that suspicion marked the beginning of a far greater danger, one he could feel already tightening around him, as quietly and precisely as a noose woven in the dark. Marco had been following threads of uncertainty for days, the weight of suspicion pressing against him like a persistent fog. Each step he took through the narrow alleys and quiet piazzas of Naples carried the memory of Luca Bernardi's fear and the unnerving realization that the real threat might be closer than he had imagined. The city around him seemed unchanged, yet every shadow felt heavier, every whisper sharper. He knew that finding the truth would demand patience, subtlety, and the careful observation he had honed over years of walking the thin line between loyalty and violence. The traitor, he realized, was not who anyone had expected. Marco retraced Luca's movements meticulously, following the subtle clues that only someone trained in quiet observation could detect. Notes in the margins of ledgers, brief glances exchanged during routine deliveries, phone calls made at odd hours, all these were pieces of a puzzle he now approached with painstaking care. Slowly, patterns began to emerge, revealing a network of deception woven with precision and deliberate concealment. The leaks had not originated from Luca, instead, they pointed toward someone much closer to Salvatore Greco, Marco's mentor. The realization hit him with the weight of betrayal, a quiet yet explosive force that left his chest tight and his mind racing. Salvatore Greco had always been a figure of stability in Marco's life, a man whose patience and insight had guided him through the early days as a young enforcer. Marco had trusted him with countless decisions, often relying on his calm judgment to navigate the murky waters of clan politics. Now, that trust seemed poised on the edge of a knife. The idea that someone close to Greco could manipulate events from within the Vesuviani clan was disorienting. Marco felt as if he had been standing on solid ground only to discover the floor shifting beneath him, revealing hidden gaps and unstable surfaces he had never anticipated. He decided to confront the situation with care, shadowing Greco's known associates and listening to conversations without drawing attention. In quiet cafes, tucked-away corners of the harbor, and dimly lit workshops, Marco pieced together evidence that confirmed his growing suspicion. Greco's lieutenant, a man with a quiet smile and a reputation for loyalty, had been feeding information to the Caprese syndicate. The betrayal was deliberate, systematic, and dangerously clever. It became clear that the traitor had been using Luca as a convenient scapegoat, ensuring that any suspicion would fall on an innocent man while the true culprit remained unseen. The realization brought a swirl of conflicting emotions. Marco felt outrage, not just at the deception itself, but at the thought of how skillfully the traitor had exploited everyone's trust. He felt a protective instinct toward Luca, who had become an unwilling pawn in a much larger game. And, perhaps most unsettlingly, he experienced a sense of foreboding, the quiet understanding that this betrayal was part of a chain of events that could lead to consequences far beyond his immediate control. Yet Marco's discipline held firm. He understood that panic could be as deadly as any weapon in the streets of Naples. Careful planning followed. Marco orchestrated meetings with key witnesses who had observed unusual behaviors, cross-referencing their accounts against delivery logs, whispered rumors, and the subtle changes in Greco's lieutenant's demeanor. Each small observation added weight to the evidence, creating a picture that was undeniable. Marco's methodical approach, a blend of patience and intuition, ensured that he could present proof without putting himself or the innocent in unnecessary danger. The clarity of his purpose steadied him in ways only years of disciplined vigilance could accomplish. When he finally confronted Luca with the evidence, he did so with both caution and reassurance. Luca's fear, which had seemed so overwhelming days earlier, now mingled with relief. He was not the traitor, and he would not be punished for something he had never done. Yet Marco's warning was clear: the real threat remained close, and the shadows that had stalked Luca might now turn toward others in the clan if not addressed promptly. The sense of looming danger added a somber gravity to their conversation, underscoring the stakes of loyalty, trust, and the delicate balance of power within the Vesuviani clan. As Marco prepared to reveal his findings to Don Vittorio, he understood that timing would be crucial. The Don, for all his composure, valued control above all else, and the revelation of a betrayal from within his trusted ranks could destabilize not only his authority but the delicate equilibrium of the clan itself. Marco needed a plan that would allow him to expose the traitor while maintaining order, ensuring that justice was delivered with precision and discretion. The intricacy of this challenge was not lost on him. He approached it with the calm, measured mindset that had earned him the name Il Falco. The confrontation with Greco's lieutenant was unavoidable. Marco arranged a private meeting under the guise of routine discussion, the location carefully chosen to avoid witnesses while allowing for strategic advantage. The lieutenant arrived, unaware that his carefully constructed web of deceit had begun to unravel. Marco spoke softly but firmly, detailing the inconsistencies he had uncovered, the observations of witnesses, and the deliberate manipulation of events that had falsely implicated Luca. The air between them was taut, a silent tension that spoke volumes. Marco's quiet authority, combined with the weight of evidence, left little room for denial. For a moment, the lieutenant attempted deflection, his calm veneer cracking under the pressure of Marco's scrutiny. But the meticulous trail of proof was undeniable. Marco watched the subtle changes in his posture, the fleeting glances, the minute gestures that betrayed guilt. The realization that he had been discovered settled over the man like a shadow, a silent acknowledgement that the game was over. In that instant, Marco understood the delicate balance of power he now held. He could exact revenge, expose the traitor, or manipulate the revelation to maintain the stability of the clan. Each choice carried consequences, yet his sense of justice and loyalty guided him toward the course that would honor both truth and prudence. Returning to report the findings to Don Vittorio, Marco carried both the burden of knowledge and the relief of having cleared Luca's name. The Don listened intently, his expression unreadable but his eyes reflecting the weight of understanding. Marco presented the evidence carefully, emphasizing facts, observations, and the calculated pattern of betrayal rather than personal interpretation. Vittorio's response was measured, acknowledging the skill and patience Marco had demonstrated, and outlining a plan to address the traitor while protecting the clan's integrity. The resolution was not immediate, but the clarity of the truth shifted the balance of tension within the organization. In the quiet aftermath, Marco walked through Naples under a soft drizzle, the city's lights reflecting on wet cobblestones. Each step was deliberate, his mind absorbing the relief that came with exposing the traitor while contemplating the fragile nature of trust. The knowledge that someone close to his mentor had been capable of such calculated deception left a lingering shadow, yet it also reinforced Marco's resolve. He understood that vigilance, patience, and measured judgment were the only tools capable of navigating a world where alliances were fluid and appearances often masked true intentions. By the time he returned to his apartment, the city seemed quieter, more peaceful, as if it too had acknowledged the uncovering of a hidden danger. The weight of betrayal had been lifted, and yet the experience had deepened his understanding of the delicate threads that held the Vesuviani clan together. Marco knew that, despite the calm, the undercurrents of power and deception would continue to flow, and only those who remained watchful could hope to navigate them safely. Marco's life seemed to move with a sense of rhythm, a steady pulse that he had come to rely on over the years. The Vesuviani clan had always operated under the surface, a silent force in the streets of Naples, their influence woven into the very fabric of the city. For Marco, it had been a life of shadows, careful, calculated, a constant balancing act between loyalty and survival. But even in the carefully constructed world he navigated, there were moments that shattered the illusion of control. Moments when the undercurrents that had always been steady began to churn, dragging everything beneath the surface. It was during these days of uneasy tension that Marco's role became more significant. The betrayal within the ranks had been dealt with, but the repercussions were far from over. The Caprese syndicate, sensing weakness in the Vesuviani, had begun to push harder. The subtle pressure that had once been limited to small disturbances had escalated. Tensions between the two groups began to bubble up in more overt ways. Small skirmishes broke out in quiet corners of the city, stabbings in alleys, abandoned warehouses set on fire, and rumors of planned ambushes. The stakes had been raised, and the balance of power teetered dangerously. Marco knew that the calm days he had once taken for granted were over. But there was a strange calm in Marco himself, an odd sense of detachment that allowed him to move through the chaos with a clarity that others lacked. The sense of purpose that had always guided him sharpened, and he began to see the city in new ways. Every street corner, every dark alley, every whisper on the wind became a part of the puzzle he was piecing together. The Caprese were smart, too smart to make their moves without knowing how the Vesuviani would respond. It wasn't just a turf war, it was a battle for control of the entire city, and every side was positioning itself for the coming storm. Marco had spent years studying the way power moved in the shadows. He had learned to listen to the unsaid, to watch how people moved when they thought no one was looking. It was this quiet observation, this ability to read the subtle changes in the world around him, that had kept him alive. He had seen how the Vesuviani had grown complacent in their dominance, how they had taken for granted their place in the city. But complacency was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Caprese were closing in, and they were doing it with a precision that Marco couldn't ignore. There were meetings, of course, and plenty of whispers among the clan. Don Vittorio was no fool, and he was well aware of the shift in the balance of power. He called together the senior members of the Vesuviani, a gathering that felt heavier than usual. The air was thick with unspoken concerns, the weight of strategy and survival pressing down on them all. Marco sat at the table, his eyes scanning the faces of the men around him. They were all seasoned, hardened by years of dealing with the unpredictable. But Marco knew they could sense it too, the calm before the storm. Vittorio's voice cut through the silence. He spoke with a calmness that Marco knew was as much about keeping his own nerves in check as it was about maintaining control over his men. The Caprisi believe they can take what's ours, Vittorio said, his eyes sweeping over the table. They think we're weak. They think we've lost our edge. But they underestimate us. And they underestimate our strength. This is a moment of testing. We will not back down. We will show them that the Vesuviani are not to be trifled with. The room was still, each man waiting for a signal, for the word that would ignite the next phase of the clan's response. Marco's mind was already working, piecing together the puzzle of what the Caprisi might do next. They had never been overtly aggressive before, preferring instead to infiltrate quietly, weaving their influence into the city's underbelly. But now, Marco could feel a change in the air. It was no longer about subtlety, it was about power, pure and simple. They wanted to break the Vesuviani, to strip them of their place in the hierarchy. As the meeting wore on, the plans took shape. They would make a statement, something that would send a clear message to the Caprisi and anyone else who might be watching. A series of coordinated actions, each designed to strike at the heart of the Caprisi's operations, would be launched within hours. Marco was tasked with overseeing the first wave, hitting the Caprisi's supply routes, cutting off their resources, and sending a message that the Vesuviani were not on the back foot. The next few hours were a blur of motion. Marco moved with practiced efficiency, rallying the men under his command, sending them to their respective positions. The streets of Naples felt different tonight, charged with a sense of purpose that pulsed through the city. Marco's footsteps echoed through the empty streets, the cool night air filled with the scent of salt and smoke from the harbor. There was something almost calming in the way the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. As the operation unfolded, Marco watched as each move unfolded with deadly precision. The Caprisi, it seemed, had underestimated the Vesuviani's ability to respond. The ambushes went smoothly, each strike landing with surgical accuracy. Marco felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but there was something more beneath it. He had become an instrument of retribution, not just for the clan, but for a personal cause, one that had been building quietly in the back of his mind ever since he'd realized the betrayal had been aimed at him. This was no longer about loyalty to Don Vittorio alone, this was about proving himself, about reclaiming control over the forces that had once threatened to undo everything he had worked for. But even as the Vesuviani took control of the night, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The smoothness of the operation felt almost too perfect. There were no mistakes, no missteps. It was as though the Caprisi had been waiting for them to strike, like they had known exactly how the Vesuviani would respond. Marco couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in his gut. Something about this felt too much like a trap. It was in that moment, as the final phase of the operation neared completion, that Marco saw it. A figure moving through the shadows, too deliberate to be an innocent bystander. Marco's instincts kicked in. He knew this street, this alley, every turn and every corner. And yet, as he moved closer to the figure, he realized with a sudden clarity that it wasn't just anyone. It was someone who had been watching the Vesuviani for weeks, someone who knew exactly how to play the game. Marco's heart pounded as he closed in, the realization dawning slowly, painfully. The Caprisi weren't simply trying to take control of the city, they were testing the Vesuviani's vulnerabilities, and Marco was their chosen target. The trap had been set for him all along. The figure turned suddenly, disappearing into the darkness just as Marco reached the spot where they had been. He had been too late. But the message was clear now, the Caprisi had not just targeted the clan, they had targeted Marco himself. The game had shifted, and Marco had become its central piece. Marco's mind was racing. The realization that the Caprisi had been targeting him specifically hit him like a wave, unsettling him to his core. He had always known the dangers that came with his position, but this felt different. It was personal now. He wasn't just a soldier in the Vesuviani clan anymore, he was a marked man, and the forces against him were more insidious than he could have imagined. For the first time in years, Marco felt exposed. The sense of invulnerability that had defined his role was slipping away, and a new reality was taking its place. As he moved through the dark alleys of Naples, the familiar streets now felt foreign. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, and every flicker of movement in the corner of his eye made his heart race. He had always been vigilant, always watching, but now the stakes had changed. The game was no longer just about the clan's survival, it was about his own. And if he didn't find a way to stay one step ahead, he would become just another casualty in the bloody battle for control over Naples. Marco took a moment to steady himself. He leaned against the wall of a narrow street, inhaling deeply, forcing himself to slow his thoughts. The familiar scent of the city, salt water from the harbor, the faint trace of old stone, the lingering heat of the day, ground him. He needed to think, to assess the situation with the same cold logic he had used countless times before. Panic wasn't an option. He couldn't afford it. The first thing Marco knew he had to do was re-establish control over the situation. He needed information. If the Caprese were coming for him, they would have eyes on him already. Every movement he made from this point forward had to be calculated, deliberate. The first step was to return to his apartment, to regroup and figure out who could be trusted. There was no time for mistakes, no room for hesitation. The traitors within the Vesuviani were still an unknown variable, and the idea that someone within his own ranks had been complicit in setting him up gnawed at him. The suspicion that had once been a distant thought now felt like a painful truth. It was late, and the city was quiet as he made his way home. The streets, usually filled with the hum of late-night activity, were eerily still. The few people he passed were strangers, their faces hidden in the darkness, eyes avoiding his. Marco's senses were on high alert, every detail around him registering in sharp clarity. He could hear the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks near the waterfront, a constant reminder of the city's pulse. But it wasn't the natural rhythm of Naples that held his focus. It was the faint click of footsteps behind him, echoing on the cobblestone street, barely audible but unmistakable. He wasn't alone. Marco didn't break his stride. He continued walking, but his mind shifted into a higher gear, considering his options. He had learned long ago that when it came to threats, subtlety was just as important as force. If someone was following him, they likely didn't know that he was aware. He glanced sideways into a darkened alley, his heart rate steady, even as the situation became more dangerous. The footsteps grew louder, then quieter, as if the follower was trying to close the distance but was unsure of how to proceed. Marco's pulse remained calm. He turned a corner abruptly, ducking into a narrow passageway between buildings. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the street remained silent. Marco pressed his back against the cool stone of the alley wall, waiting, his breath steady. He heard nothing, not even the usual sounds of distant conversations or the scrape of a cart along the cobblestones. Just as he was about to move again, a figure stepped into the alley, their face barely visible in the shadows. Marco's body tensed instinctively, his hand hovering near the small pistol hidden under his jacket. He hadn't yet seen the figure's face, but the outline of the person, slender, quick, told him this wasn't an enemy from the Caprese. No, this was someone else. The figure spoke before Marco could react, their voice low and soft but unmistakably familiar. "You're being watched, Marco." Marco's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. The figure stepped closer, and the moonlight revealed her face, Carmen, a woman who had been an informant of sorts for Marco. She had deep ties to the city's underworld, and over the years, she had proved useful to him more times than he cared to count. But there was always something dangerous about Carmen, something he couldn't quite trust. She had always walked a fine line between ally and adversary, and Marco had learned to tread carefully when it came to her. "What do you know?" Marco asked quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. His instincts told him to be careful, but the situation was too pressing to delay. Carmen hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously down the street. "There's a leak, Marco. Someone's feeding information to the Caprese, and it's coming from inside the Vesuviani. It's not just you they're after." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been tracking your every move for weeks." Marco's mind churned with a mix of dread and resolve. The betrayal that had set this chain of events into motion was now undeniable. He had long been aware that loyalty in the world of organized crime was as fragile as glass, but to think that someone within the Vesuviani had sold him out, it was a bitter reality that gnawed at his core. Carmen's warning, though not unexpected, had been the final wake-up call. The sense of betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could, and it fueled the fire within him. Whoever was behind this was playing a game far beyond his own understanding, and Marco had no intention of being its pawn. As he followed Carmen through the dark streets of Naples, his every step became more deliberate, more purposeful. The once familiar city now seemed like a maze, its streets filled with danger at every turn. The city had always been a place of opportunity, a place where power was claimed through blood and cunning. But now, as Marco's thoughts spiraled, he wondered just how much of the city he could still trust. Had everything he had built, every alliance he had forged, been based on lies? The Vesuviani had long stood as a dominant force, but in the shadows, there were enemies whose patience was unmatched. Carmen led him through narrow alleys and dimly lit side streets, places where even the police rarely ventured. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick night air. Marco's mind never strayed far from the dangers that lay ahead. Carmen had spoken of a plan, and though he trusted her more than most, Marco knew better than to place all his faith in others. The underworld was rife with deception, and everyone had their own agenda. They arrived at an old, abandoned warehouse near the docks, a place Marco recognized but hadn't visited in years. The air smelled of salt and decay, the wooden planks of the warehouse floor creaking beneath their feet as they entered. Inside, the low hum of machinery echoed in the otherwise silent space. Carmen led him deeper into the shadows, where a figure stood waiting. Marco couldn't make out the person's face immediately, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Another ally, another piece of the puzzle. The figure stepped forward, revealing himself to be Antonio, a former soldier in the Vesuviani who had fallen out of favor years ago. Marco had heard rumors about him, about his fall from grace, about his ties to the black market, but never about any possible involvement in this conflict. Antonio's eyes were dark, and his face was drawn with a grim expression. There was a hardened look in his eyes, one that Marco hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a man who had survived the worst and was prepared to survive the next storm. "I knew you'd come," Antonio said, his voice gruff but steady. "I don't know how much time we have, but we need to move. They're already planning the next phase." "Who's behind this?" Marco asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Who's the traitor?" Antonio shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's not just one person. The Caprisi have infiltrated more than we realized. There are men in the Vesuviani who've been working with them for months, feeding them information, sabotaging our operations. It's a web of deceit, and we've been blind to it." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. The realization that there were multiple traitors, working in concert to bring the Vesuviani to its knees, was a blow he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just a matter of hunting down a single mole, it was about tearing apart the very fabric of the clan itself. "How do you know all of this?" Marco asked, his suspicion growing. Antonio didn't meet his eyes immediately, instead looking toward the shadows. "I've been watching," he said quietly. "I've seen the signs. I've been keeping an eye on certain men, listening to whispers. And I've connected the dots." He paused. The Caprisi knew the Vesuviani would be distracted by the betrayal from within. "They've been moving against us all along, waiting for the right moment to strike." Marco felt his pulse quicken. The pieces were falling into place now, but there was one thing that still didn't make sense. If the Caprisi had been watching them for months, why hadn't they struck sooner? Why wait until Marco's operation against their supply lines before making their move? "They're waiting for the right time," Antonio continued, as if reading Marco's thoughts. "The moment the Vesuviani show signs of weakness, they'll move in. They know that if they wait, they can dismantle everything we've built. Marco's thoughts raced. The Caprese had never been known for being impatient. They had always been calculating, slow-moving in their quest for power. But now, it seemed that they were ready to strike with deadly precision. The warning had come too late, and Marco realized that the clan was teetering on the edge of collapse. "We need to strike first," Marco said, his voice low and decisive. "We can't wait for them to make their move. We need to hit them hard, disrupt their plans." Antonio met his gaze, his eyes narrowing. "You're talking about war, Marco. A full-scale assault on the Caprese. It's not just a matter of a few ambushes anymore. This is a fight to the death." The first gunfire erupted just after midnight, echoing through the narrow streets like the crack of a thunderstorm. Marco stood at the edge of the alley, his heart steady, his eyes locked on the flickering lights of the Caprese safe house ahead. The Vesuviani strike team moved like ghosts, silent, deliberate, each man knowing exactly what to do. For weeks, Marco had planned this counterattack, and every second of preparation now converged into this single, decisive moment. The Caprese had become too bold, too confident, and Marco intended to remind them that Naples still belonged to the Vesuviani. The air was thick with tension. The distant hum of the city's nightlife was drowned out by the low rumble of engines and the faint shuffle of boots on wet pavement. The rain had started earlier that evening, turning the cobblestones slick and reflective, each puddle glinting under the weak glow of street lamps. Marco felt the weight of the pistol in his hand, cold, familiar, almost comforting. Violence had become an unspoken language in his world, and tonight, that language would speak louder than words. A faint signal from Antonio broke the silence. Two sharp taps on the wall, a warning that the Caprese guards were shifting positions. Marco nodded and motioned to his men. They fanned out, taking positions along the perimeter of the building. Carmen, who had insisted on being there despite Marco's objections, stood a few paces behind him, her eyes darting toward every shadow. Her presence unnerved him slightly. She was not a soldier, but her instincts had proved useful before. Tonight, however, he needed focus, not sentiment. The first explosion tore through the quiet like a scream. A flash of orange burst from the back entrance of the warehouse, followed by the metallic crash of falling debris. The Caprese guards stumbled out, shouting orders, but their confusion was their undoing. Marco's men opened fire with precision, their shots quick and efficient. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Years of discipline and bloodshed had turned the Vesuviani into a machine, and tonight, that machine was fully awake. Marco moved through the chaos with eerie calm. Every move was calculated, a quick shot, a silent step, a glance to confirm his men's positions. He had no interest in unnecessary violence. This was about control, about restoring order to the empire that had been slipping away. As he stepped into the main floor of the warehouse, the smoke burned his lungs and blurred his vision. Through the haze, he saw a man running toward the stairs, one of the Caprese lieutenants, if the intelligence was correct. Marco followed without hesitation. The stairwell was narrow and smelled of oil and rust. Marco's boots pounded against the metal steps, each echo marking his ascent. At the top, he caught sight of the lieutenant, who turned just long enough to fire a desperate shot. The bullet grazed the wall inches from Marco's head, showering him with fragments of plaster. He returned fire instinctively, the sharp recoil jarring through his arm. The man fell without a sound, his body crumpling against the railing. Marco didn't stop to look, he moved past him, deeper into the dimly lit corridor. From below, the gunfire was fading. The Vesuviani had done their job. The Caprese resistance was collapsing faster than expected, which meant one of two things: either the attack had caught them completely off guard, or something about this was too easy. Marco had been in enough fights to know when a battle didn't feel right. He paused at the end of the hallway, listening. Somewhere below, he could hear the faint creak of metal, the subtle groan of something shifting under the weight of the building. Then he saw it, the brief flash of movement in the reflection of a shattered window. Marco ducked instinctively just as a bullet whizzed past his ear. He rolled to the side, drew his weapon, and fired twice toward the source. The figure in the shadows fell backward, clutching their chest. Marco approached cautiously, gun raised. When the smoke cleared, his stomach twisted. The person on the floor wasn't one of the Caprese. It was one of his own men, a Vesuviani soldier, one he had handpicked for this operation. The man was still alive, his breath shallow and erratic. Marco knelt beside him. "Who did this?" he asked, gripping the man's collar. The soldier's eyes darted toward the corner of the room. Inside, he managed to whisper, blood bubbling at his lips. Then he went still. Marco rose, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room beyond the doorway was dark except for the faint glow of a lantern. He stepped inside, his senses heightened. The sound of rain tapping against the roof mixed with the steady drip of water from a broken pipe. And then he saw him. Seated at a table in the center of the room was a man Marco hadn't expected to see, Franco Bellini, one of Don Vittorio's top advisors. His expression was calm, almost indifferent, as if the violence outside had nothing to do with him. "I was wondering when you'd find your way up here," Franco said, his voice steady. Marco's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" "Finishing what you started," Franco replied with a faint smirk. "You didn't really think you were the only one planning an attack tonight, did you?" The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. It was then that Marco understood, the Caprese had been ready because someone had warned them. The betrayal went deeper than he'd imagined. Franco wasn't here by accident, he was orchestrating it. "You sold us out," Marco said quietly, his tone cold. Franco shrugged. "I made a deal. The Vesuviani are finished, Marco. Vittorio is a relic. The Caprese know the future of this city lies with cooperation, not bloodshed. There's no room for men like him, or you." Marco felt a flash of rage, but beneath it was something colder, more focused. He took a step forward, his weapon still trained on Franco. "You think they'll keep their word?" he asked. "You think they'll share the city with you? They'll use you until they don't need you anymore." Franco's smirk faltered just slightly, but he didn't respond. Marco saw his hesitation, the faintest crack in his composure, and that was all he needed. In one fluid motion, Marco raised his pistol and fired. The shot echoed through the building, followed by silence. Franco slumped forward, the faint light flickering over his motionless body. Downstairs, the last bursts of gunfire faded into stillness. The Vesuviani had won the battle, but Marco knew better than to celebrate. As he stood there, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air, he realized that this was only the beginning. Franco's betrayal had confirmed what he already feared, the rot had spread deep into the heart of the Vesuviani. This wasn't just a war with the Caprese anymore. It was a war within their own ranks, a war that would consume them all if he didn't act quickly. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, washing away the blood on the cobblestones. Marco stepped out into the night, his coat soaked, his expression unreadable. The storm had arrived, and there would be no calm until it passed. Marco's thoughts were a tangled mess as he moved through the dark streets of Naples. The night was still thick with the smell of smoke, a scent that lingered in his nostrils even as he passed through the alleys and narrow roads that had once been so familiar. The rain had stopped, but the city felt colder than it ever had before, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had just killed one of his own, a man who had once been a trusted ally. But the truth was undeniable now, there was no room for hesitation, no room for second chances. The Vesuviani was at war, and the war was not just against their enemies but against their own treachery. Franco's death had been the turning point, but Marco knew that it was only the beginning. The betrayal within his own ranks had been deeper than he could have ever imagined, and the thought of facing more traitors in his own family made his blood run cold. They had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Marco's empire began to crack. They had waited patiently, biding their time, and now they were making their move. There were more of them out there, and Marco had to root them out before they could destroy everything he had worked for. He turned the corner onto another street, his boots clicking against the wet pavement. The city was alive around him, but there was a hollow feeling in his chest. The sounds of everyday life, laughter, conversation, the hum of traffic, felt like they were happening in a world far removed from the one he inhabited. The world he knew was one of shadows and violence, a world where loyalty was bought and sold like any other commodity, and betrayal was the price of doing business. Carmen had disappeared after the attack. Marco wasn't sure where she had gone, but he knew she would be back. She always was. He had come to rely on her in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. She was his rock, his anchor in a world that constantly threatened to swallow him whole. But even she wasn't immune to the storm that was brewing. He didn't know who he could trust anymore, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out and checked the message, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. It was from Antonio. "We have a lead. Meet me at the docks. Urgent." Marco's heart skipped a beat. The docks. That was where the Caprese had been smuggling in weapons for years. It was a place of power and secrecy, where the underworld mingled with the legitimate business of the city. The docks had always been a neutral ground for those who understood the rules, but now Marco realized that they had become a battleground. Whoever controlled the docks controlled the flow of power in Naples, and it was clear that the Caprese had set their sights on taking it for themselves. He didn't waste any time. He made his way to the car parked on the side of the street and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and Marco drove through the city's winding streets with a purpose. His mind was sharp now, focused on the task at hand. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the future of the Vesuviani, for everything he had built. And he knew that if he didn't act fast, he would lose it all. The drive to the docks felt like an eternity, but Marco pushed through the unease that tried to creep up on him. He had faced death countless times before, and yet tonight felt different. The stakes were higher now, the consequences more dire. As he neared the docks, he could see the faint glow of the streetlights reflecting off the water. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, and the sound of distant ships echoed across the harbor. Antonio was waiting near one of the warehouses, his figure barely visible in the dim light. Marco pulled up next to him and rolled down the window. Antonio leaned in, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "The Caprese are making their move tonight. They're going to hit the warehouse on the north side, our warehouse. We have to stop them before they get there." Marco's blood ran cold. The warehouse on the north side was one of their most important assets. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, sharp and relentless, a staccato rhythm that seemed to vibrate in the very air around Marco. His pulse raced as he sprinted forward, his boots slapping against the wet ground, the rain starting again in heavy sheets. The rainwater mixed with the grime of the streets, making everything slick and treacherous. Every corner felt like a trap, and every shadow seemed to hold a potential enemy. They had walked right into it. The warehouse doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, trapping Marco and his men inside. It was an ambush. The realization hit him hard, this was no coincidence. The Caprese had been too quiet, too calculating. They had lured Marco and his team into this rat's maze, knowing they would come for the warehouse. Now, they were surrounded. There was no turning back. "Get to cover!" Marco shouted, his voice low but commanding, cutting through the chaos like a knife. His men scattered, seeking shelter behind crates, steel beams, anything that might offer protection. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, the taste of fear lingering in Marco's mouth. The room felt smaller than it had moments ago, every inch of space a potential threat. The flickering lights overhead cast long, eerie shadows, making it impossible to tell where the Caprese soldiers were positioned. Marco pressed himself against a stack of crates, his fingers tightening around his pistol. He was a man of action, but even he knew when to wait, when to observe. His breathing slowed, his mind calculating the best way to break out of this mess. He needed to find the source of the gunfire, to figure out where the capricci were concentrated, and then take control of the situation. Antonio's voice crackled through the comms, sharp and urgent. "Marco, they've got the main exit blocked. We're trapped. But there's a rear exit near the back of the warehouse. If we can get there, we can break out." Marco's eyes darted around, calculating the distance. The back exit was their only shot, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The capricci had already set up positions, and they weren't going to let them slip away without a fight. He took a deep breath, his thoughts sharp and focused. They couldn't afford to stay pinned down. The longer they waited, the worse it would get. "We're moving." "On my signal," Marco replied, his voice cold and steady, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses. "Keep your heads down and move fast." He looked over to Carmen, who had taken up a position near the side, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't need words to understand the plan. They had been through too much together, worked side by side in countless operations, to need more than a glance. Carmen gave him a slight nod, her grip tightening around her weapon. She was ready. As if on cue, Marco motioned, signaling his men to move. They darted out from their cover, low to the ground, moving quickly but cautiously. The room seemed to grow colder as they advanced, the oppressive silence between shots adding to the tension. Marco's mind raced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about sending a message. The safe house was a quiet place, hidden away from the hustle of the streets, tucked behind layers of secrecy and layers of false identities. Marco had always trusted it, not just as a strategic point of refuge, but as a symbol of security in the chaos of his world. When he and his men arrived, the stillness was almost unnerving. No one spoke as they filed through the door, the sound of rain tapping against the windows like an unwanted guest in the room. Carmen had been silent during the walk back, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Marco could see the strain in her posture, the weight of the events pressing on her. It was the same for all of them. The capricci had not only launched an attack, they had exposed a wound within their ranks. A traitor was among them, and that knowledge hung over everything like a shadow. The air inside the safe house felt thick with it, the tension palpable, like the calm before a storm. Marco glanced over at Antonio as he took a seat, his breath still heavy from the chase. His eyes were sharp, though, calculating, always assessing. Antonio had been his right hand for years, and Marco could tell that he was as troubled by the night's events as he was. They had lost more than just a warehouse and some supplies tonight, they had lost trust. And trust was the only currency that truly mattered in this world. "We need to find out who did this," Marco said quietly, his voice a low rumble. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each man and woman in the room. "We cannot afford any more mistakes." Antonio nodded, the weight of the situation clearly settling in. The capricci knew too much. It's not just about the warehouse. Someone fed them details. Someone here is working with them. His eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in, someone with answers, or worse, someone with more treachery. Marco didn't respond right away. He sat down at the table, his hands folded together, staring at the map spread across it. The streets of Naples were familiar to him, but tonight they felt alien, like they no longer belonged to him. He traced a finger over the paper, but the movements were mechanical, absent. He wasn't thinking about the map. He wasn't thinking about strategy. His mind was consumed with one question: who was the traitor? The safe house was secure, but it wasn't immune to the dangers of betrayal. Marco knew that better than anyone. He had seen alliances fracture before, seen men he once trusted turn on him for their own gain. The more he thought about it, the more obvious it became that the leak had been there for some time. Franco's death had been a sign, a warning that someone had been playing both sides. But it wasn't just Franco. It was deeper, more systematic. They had been feeding information to the Caprese for months, slowly weakening the Vesuviani from the inside. It was a betrayal that went beyond business. It was personal. Marco stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "We start with Franco's men," he said, his voice sharp. "We find out who he was close to. We go through every detail, every transaction. Someone here knows something. We need to dig deep." Carmen stood up as well, her movements fluid. She had been silent for too long. "And when we find them?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. Marco turned to face her, meeting her gaze. There was no hesitation in his eyes. "We eliminate them." The finality in his voice was like the closing of a door, and for a moment, no one spoke. Carmen's expression softened for just a moment, the fire in her eyes dimming. She understood the weight of his words. They all did. But they also understood that there was no room for mercy in their world. Not when they were facing a threat this deep. Marco had learned long ago that compassion had no place in the mafia. Loyalty, power, control, those were the only currencies that mattered. "We'll get to work," Antonio said, his voice rough. "We'll comb through every contact, every person who was close to Franco. Someone will slip up." The hours passed in silence as Marco and his men sifted through the information they had. The safe house became a hub of activity as phone calls were made, names were cross-referenced, and leads were followed. It was an exhausting process, but Marco couldn't afford to sleep. Not tonight. Not until the traitor was exposed. He sat at the table, eyes narrowed, reviewing every scrap of information, every detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. Carmen came to him after a while, her face drawn but focused. She placed a stack of files in front of him. "These are the men Franco kept close. There's a pattern," she said. "They're all connected to a network of Caprese sympathizers." Marco flipped through the files, his fingers moving quickly over the pages. He stopped at one name, his eyes narrowing. It was an unfamiliar face, but the connection was clear. This man had been involved in several shipments, some of which had gone missing. He had been one of Franco's trusted operatives, and now it seemed he had been playing both sides all along. Marco's heart sank, but the anger was cold, calculated. "This is our man," Marco said, his voice steady. The streets of Naples were nearly deserted when Marco and his men made their move. Dawn had barely broken, the sky a pale gray, and the city's familiar hum had not yet awakened. The quiet only amplified the tension that hung between them, the kind that came before something inevitable, something final. Every footstep seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the narrow alleys as if the city itself was holding its breath. Marco led the way, his coat pulled tight against the chill, his mind focused on the task ahead. They were hunting a ghost, a man who had betrayed everything they stood for. And Marco intended to bring him in, dead or alive. Antonio walked beside him, silent but alert. His hand rested near his holster, his eyes scanning every window, every shadow. The rest of the team followed close behind, their faces hard and unreadable. They all knew what was coming. None of them questioned Marco's orders. Not after what had happened. Not after the betrayal that had nearly torn the Vesuviani apart from the inside. The traitor's name was Riccardo Mancini. To the outside world, he had been nothing more than a mid-level enforcer, a man who handled shipments, supervised the docks, and ensured that the Vesuviani's operations ran smoothly. But in the past few months, he had been feeding information to the Caprese, helping them intercept shipments, set traps, and ambush Vesuviani soldiers. The man had played both sides masterfully, hiding behind a mask of loyalty. But now, his mask had slipped, and Marco was coming for him. They found Riccardo's hideout at the edge of the city, near the abandoned rail yards. It was a place no one went anymore, desolate, forgotten, haunted by the ghosts of industry. The buildings stood like hulking skeletons against the pale light, their broken windows reflecting shards of dawn. Marco stopped at the edge of the yard and signaled for silence. He could feel the tension building, the electricity in the air before the strike. Antonio leaned close. 2 lookouts by the front, he whispered. At least 3 inside, maybe more. Ricardo's smart, he won't be alone. Marco nodded. We don't wait, he said. We go in fast, hit hard, end it quick. He adjusted his weapon and gave the signal. Within moments, his men fanned out, moving like shadows across the cracked concrete. The first 2 guards went down before they even knew what hit them, 2 silent shots, 2 bodies collapsing into the dirt. Marco moved forward, his heart steady, his senses sharp. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about cleansing, cutting out the rot before it spread any further. As they breached the building, gunfire erupted. The sound tore through the morning stillness, echoing across the yard. The air filled with dust and the sharp tang of gunpowder. Marco ducked behind a rusted pillar, returning fire with precision. The echoes of battle were strangely muted in his mind. Time slowed, each motion deliberate, practiced. He could see every detail, the flash of a muzzle, the spray of sparks as bullets struck metal, the faint outlines of his enemies in the dim light. One of his men, Pietro, took a hit and went down with a grunt. Marco's jaw tightened, but he didn't hesitate. He fired 2 more shots, dropping the man who had pulled the trigger. There was no room for grief. Not now. Not until this was over. They pressed forward through the main hall, clearing the rooms one by one. The floor was littered with debris, old crates, scraps of metal, shattered glass. Each step echoed like a heartbeat. Marco led them toward the back of the building, where the faint light of a single bulb flickered through a doorway. He could feel it in his gut, Ricardo was there. When they burst through the door, Marco saw him immediately. Ricardo was standing near a table, a gun in his hand, a look of defiance on his face. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, but he still had that same smug confidence, the kind of arrogance that came from believing he was always one step ahead. Marco, Ricardo said, his voice calm, almost casual. I was wondering when you'd come. Marco raised his gun, but didn't fire. You made this easy for me, he said. You could have run. You could have disappeared. Ricardo smirked. And leave all this behind? No, Marco. I built part of this empire, same as you. I just learned something you never did, that loyalty doesn't keep you alive. Money does. Power does. The Caprese understood that. Antonio stepped forward, fury burning in his eyes. You sold out your own family, Ricardo. You got our people killed. Ricardo shrugged, unfazed. Collateral damage. You think Vittorio's empire was going to last forever? The old ways are dying, Antonio. I just chose to be on the winning side. The words hung in the air, poisonous and heavy. Marco felt a cold anger rising inside him, but his face remained unreadable. You think betrayal buys you safety? He asked quietly. You think the Caprese will trust you when they're done with us? You're nothing to them, Ricardo. Just another pawn. Ricardo laughed softly. Maybe. But I'll still be alive. That's more than I can say for you. The moment stretched thin, like a wire ready to snap. The days that followed were a blur of action, each moment moving faster than the last. Marco's mind was consumed by the aftermath of Ricardo's betrayal. The safe house had become a temporary headquarters, where plans were made, alliances were re-evaluated, and every conversation carried a weight that felt heavier than before. The streets of Naples, once a familiar battleground, now felt foreign, as if the very air had shifted. Marco could feel the tension in the people around him. The men who had once looked to him for leadership now watched him with a wariness that hadn't been there before. In the wake of Ricardo's death, the Vesuviani were no longer just a criminal empire. They were a wounded beast, vulnerable and dangerous. The Caprese, sensing this weakness, were making their moves, tightening their grip on territories that had once belonged to Marco's family. There were whispers in the underworld, rumors of alliances forming, betrayals yet to come, and power shifts that could change the balance forever. Marco knew this was a crossroads. He could either rise above the chaos, rebuild his empire, or let the waves of treachery and violence drown him. Every decision felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 lives, each action potentially tipping the scales toward survival or ruin. Late one evening, Marco sat in his office, a room that had once felt like a command center, but now seemed like the last bastion of a dying dynasty. His fingers traced the edge of a map, streets, borders, names of neighborhoods, symbols of everything he had worked to control. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He looked up just as Antonio entered the room, his face grim, his eyes betraying the exhaustion of someone who had been running on empty for too long. "We've got a problem," Antonio said, his voice low, but urgent. He didn't wait for Marco to ask before continuing. "The Capricci are pushing harder. They're taking over the docks, the nightclubs. We've lost 2 shipments in the last week, and word is, they're bringing in reinforcements." Marco's jaw tightened. The docks were crucial. If the Capricci controlled the shipments, it would cripple the Vesuviani's operations. The nightclubs, though less important in the larger scheme of things, were still a significant source of revenue. Losing both was a blow that Marco couldn't afford. "How are we handling it?" Marco asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fire that was building inside him. "We've got men on the ground, but we're outnumbered," Antonio replied. "We've tried negotiating with some of the smaller players, but they're scared. The Capricci are ruthless. They've made it clear that anyone who doesn't fall in line will be dealt with." Marco stood up, his thoughts racing. His mind flickered back to the early days when things had been simpler, when all it took was a single word from him to shift the balance. But that was before Ricardo. Before the betrayals. Before the trust had been shattered. Now, everything was a gamble. He had to move quickly, decisively, before the Capricci became an unstoppable force. "We take back what's ours," Marco said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We'll hit them hard, show them we're not finished yet. But we need to strike at their heart. We need to hit them where they least expect it." Antonio's eyes darkened, his expression hardening. "I'll get the men ready." "You're sure about this?" Marco met his gaze, his resolve unshaken. "It's the only way." The plan was set in motion quickly. Marco knew that every move from here on out had to be calculated, precise. The Vesuviani had been scattered, weakened, but Marco still held power. He knew this city, knew its rhythms, its secrets. And he knew that with the right strike, the Capricci could be pushed back, at least for a time. They weren't invincible. No one was. They began by targeting the Capricci's operations at the docks. It wasn't just about retaking the shipments, it was about sending a message. Marco's men hit the docks under the cover of night, moving with the kind of precision that only years of practice could bring. The Capricci didn't see it coming. By the time their reinforcements arrived, Marco's men had already vanished, leaving behind nothing but destruction and fear. The Capricci had lost several key shipments and suffered casualties that would leave them reeling. Marco knew it was only a temporary victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. But even as the Capricci reeled from the loss, Marco knew the real battle had yet to come. The war for Naples wasn't just fought in the streets, it was fought in the minds of the people. The underworld was filled with power struggles, with factions that wanted to take control. Marco had seen it all before. He knew how quickly loyalties could shift, how easily people could be swayed by fear or greed. The Vesuviani needed more than just victories, they needed to reclaim the loyalty of the people. Marco's thoughts turned inward, to his own people, to the ones who had stood by him through thick and thin. He thought of Carmen, who had always been by his side, who had seen the good in him when no one else had. She had been through so much, yet she remained loyal, steadfast. And Antonio, his oldest friend, who had never wavered in his support. They were the only constants in a world that seemed to change every day. He knew that the loyalty of his people was fragile, that trust once broken could never be fully repaired. Ricardo's betrayal had left scars that ran deep, and Marco understood the danger of losing his men's faith. It was a delicate balance, one that he couldn't afford to tip. In the days that followed, Marco began to meet with the key players in Naples, smaller families, independent operators, men and women who could tip the scales of power in his favor. He didn't offer them loyalty or friendship, he offered them security. He offered them power. He made it clear that those who stood with him would be rewarded, those who didn't would find themselves on the losing side. Marco understood that fear was a powerful motivator, but he also knew that loyalty built on fear was temporary. It was trust that held empires together, and trust was what Marco needed to rebuild. As the days turned into weeks, Marco began to feel the weight of his decisions. The violence, the bloodshed, it all took its toll. His men were tired, worn down by the constant conflict. Carmen came to him one evening, her face drawn with concern. "You're pushing them too hard," she said softly. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Marco looked up from the table, meeting her gaze. "We don't have a choice," he replied, his voice hard but tinged with exhaustion. "We need to keep moving. If we stop now, the caprici will take everything." She nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I know. But you can't fight like this forever, Marco." He felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He knew she was right. But what other choice did he have? The caprici were coming for him, for his family, for everything he had built. There was no time for rest, no time for doubt. And yet, deep down, Marco wondered how much longer he could keep this up. How much longer he could keep running this race, fighting battles that seemed endless. He had always been driven by the need to win, to dominate, to control. But at what cost? The question haunted him late at night, when the adrenaline of the day had worn off, and the weight of his choices settled on his shoulders. He looked out the window of his office, watching the city below. Naples. It had always been his city, but now it felt like a place he no longer recognized. The streets were alive with movement, but it was the kind of energy that felt chaotic, uncontained. Marco wondered if he had the strength to rebuild, not just his empire, but the trust that had been broken, the relationships that had been fractured. But one thing was clear, he wasn't done yet. The Vesuviani might have been wounded, but they were still alive. And as long as he drew breath, Marco would fight. The game was far from over. And in the end, only one thing mattered: survival.